are accounted for. Okay, we're green now. So thank you all for your involvement, discussion, and in the morning and in the morning session, and then with the Community Advisory Committee. Thank you for your, I guess, flexibility as the timelines for the sections have run over, so there's been a minimal amount of time for break, and I understand that is aware mentally, physically, so thank you for holding in. We'll have a couple hours of further discussion for these upcoming topics, and these topics the discussion will end at 5 p.m. and then 6 p.m. is when the public comment, the public involvement session begins. So we're almost there. We will start back at the long range transportation plan, processes and updates. Yeah, this could be the intro. I haven't seen like a slide with moving.
It's like TV. This is fantastic.
That's about,
Y'all's been waiting for this all week.
MGL.
the visualization techniques come in.
You don't mess around.
There's a cover charge on your way.
So thank you. Definitely excited to present our long-range transportation planning process. I know Chelsea mentioned missing out some of the breaks. This presentation will not help make up any of that time because we have a very comprehensive process and we want to take the time to showcase that. And I have a lot of slides. I'm a very visual person, so it's a lot of visual slides. And even with that, I'm only scratching on the surface of what it is that we do and the depths that we go into collaboration and our comprehensive approach. So with that, when it comes to our long-range transportation plan, we have a lot of considerations that we know that upfront that we have to consider as we're developing the region's long-range transportation plan. And we identify this in coordination with our stakeholders, including the public. So of course, we have regional economic drivers that we have to pay attention to as we're developing transportation. We want to be mindful of that multimodal connectivity because as we all know, our LRTPs must be multimodal. With us, close to Virginia, we have to, think about resiliency, demographic considerations, and of course, funding. How do we pay for the things that we need? So we have come up with a very structured approach to our long-range transportation plan, and this is what I'm going to be covering today. In our LRTP, we use exploratory scenario planning. So I'm going to dive into that, but basically it's just it's a way to say how do we prepare for future uncertainty. We have a very robust project prioritization tool that we've been using for 15 years now, which is a very objective data-driven methodology for evaluating candidate projects. Of course, we look at resiliency and vulnerability, as I just mentioned, and with every LRTP cycle, we're seeing how do we improve that? How do we even do it better? And that also goes for equity and accessibility. We're always mindful of it and with the projects that we're recommending, but how do we keep doing it better with every LRTP cycle? Of course, a lot of this doesn't happen without great collaboration with our region, locality staff, the state, our federal partners, and of course the public. So throughout the process at major milestones, we are coordinating at various levels, just with community groups all the way up to our mayors and with our outreach. And we mix up our outreach with both traditional and virtual platforms so that we can reach a broad and diverse public. So we have different surveys that we've used, interactive maps and web apps, social media. We are revitalizing our back to school program. We'll be doing that here probably in the next six to 9 months. We'll be back in the schools. And of course, traditional reports and meetings. More recently, we created what we call our LRTP metaverse, and it's a 3D representation where the public can come in and learn about the long-range transportation plan, and we can update these billboards, and they can actually walk around. We have 4 different rooms, learn about the regional planning process, and there's even ways to engage with staff. There's little avatars, and it's a way for us to sort of connect even with the younger generation and get them to learn about what we do here at the TPO. So our current long-range transportation plan is for the horizon year of 2045. That was adopted in June of 2021, just after our previous certification review. And our 2050, we've been working on that since, and we need to adopt the 2050 by June of 2026. I'm kind of going to merge both of these because our approach to the 2045 and the 2050 are very similar, other than we're trying to enhance some of those approaches with the 2050. So with the 2045 LRTP, I'm just going to show some highlights here. Again, that plan was adopted in 2021. This shows that when we do our LRTP, right off the top, we're recognizing that we have maintenance issues, so we're taking that right off the top. And then what's left over is where we try to address those transportation needs that we have been identified with our collaboration with the stakeholders and the public. So in the 2045 LRTP, that's almost $14 billion of additional multimodal investments for the region over that 2045 planning horizon. And then we break that down in terms of what's roadway versus transit versus active transportation in our intermodal freight-related projects. Our 2045 LRTP is documented through a series of reports. We started this back in the 2040 process, and what we found with our stakeholders and the public is instead of having one intimidating report, we've got several smaller reports, and they can just go to that report for the topic that they're interested in. As part of the 2045, we really made a concerted effort to try to have engaging graphics and make it much more public friendly to people who aren't transportation professionals, that they can understand our process. And then we've included a lot more interactive maps, story maps, to walk them through how we develop the LRTP. I already mentioned the collaboration and outreach. Again, there's multiple opportunities for public comment, key decision points. I know there was some mention at the CAC. With any of our major milestones, we go through all of our advisory committees, including the CAC, where they're able to see, before the decisions are made, they're able to see, what are the candidate projects you're going to be looking at to evaluate? What are those draft prioritization scores? What is that draft fiscally constrained list of projects? And we get comments from our various committees before the board makes a final decision. As part of 2045, we actually updated our prioritization tool, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And the CAC had an opportunity to give us input on measures and weights for that tool. Of course, we had the pandemic, so we had to be very creative towards the end on how we got our engagement. So we did a lot of recorded presentations to supplement being able to meet face-to-face, and of course, the virtual platforms, and try to do it in a more digestible format. So again, just being very flexible to still have the robust engagement. One of the recommended actions or recommendations from the last certification was our use of the term regional priority projects. With the HRTF, it was limited to just highway projects, and we recognized with the recommendation from the certification review that from the public, they could think that we're focusing too much on highway. So we made sure that when we're using that term regional priority projects, we're also highlighting the regional transit projects, and that would really be the 757 Express. And then those regional priority active transportation projects, which namely are the Birthplace of America Trail, which is now the Trail 757, and the Southampton Roads Trail.
I'm sorry, the 757, I'm sorry. So I heard it throughout the day.
Trail
757 Express, is that a HRT system, or is that the regional transit including, what is it?
So the 757 Express is for the HRT system. It's 13 regional backbone routes that for the first time, as you all know, one of the problems we have is that HRT's always been funded with 6 different city budgets, which creates inconsistencies. 13 bus routes to interconnect the 6 HRT cities with 15-minute service intervals with bus stop amenities and technology. That's the 757 Express.
And that's not the only transit in the plan. That's just the transit we're calling out as the regional priority with those regional funds. So there's more transit in the plan. This is just us saying those are where those regional funds are covering. And then we're also highlighting those regional trails. So, 2050, this is what we're currently working on for our long-range transportation plan. And, everyone in this room knows it's really everything between now and 2050, and that we know it's not this perfect straight line when we're trying to say, how do we plan for transportation? It's really lots of twists and turns, and there's a number of things that are going to just change our assumptions in terms of the future. So for us, we're acknowledging that up front. We're saying, we really don't know exactly what's going to happen when we're planning for transportation. There's so many things, especially in our region. We've got the transatlantic data cables, the fiber ring that could bring different types of jobs here. We've got our military and our port. We've got sea level rise issues and concerns, connected autonomous vehicles, artificial intelligence, flying cars. We actually have a candidate project for, the flying
Water taxis.
water taxis. I mean, these are things that we have to think about, as we collaborate with our stakeholders. So for us, the way we address that is with exploratory scenario planning. And basically we're saying, let's stop trying to predict the future. Instead, let's prepare for uncertainty. And then my visual there is it's not about hitting that bullseye. It's about just trying to cover the dartboard as we prepare our long-range transportation plan. We explore different growth scenarios. This is done in collaboration with our stakeholders. And what we're doing is we're stress testing the transportation system. So if we have these multiple plausible futures, we want to make sure that we have a transportation system that is robust and it is resilient and it can meet these range of future possibilities. This is another way to look at that. So, historically, we just had a baseline that we would test candidate projects and say to our board, here's our recommendation. So now, instead of just doing the baseline, which is based off of locality comprehensive plans, we're also looking at 3 greater growth scenarios. Again, this is done in collaboration with our stakeholders. And so with these 4 different multiple plausible futures, we evaluate each and every candidate project. Again, this is how we're ranking the most robust projects for the region. This is our project prioritization tool. I could talk about our tool for an hour by itself. I will not. I will just tell you that we do score our projects by different categories because how we would rank and rate a bridge and tunnel project is very different on how we would rate an active transportation project. So we want to make sure in our tool that when we're saying this project scored 200, that it's apples to apples regardless of what type of project it is. And within our tool, we have 3 components. We look at project utility, which is the ability to solve a transportation problem, such as congestion or safety or connectivity. We look at economic vitality, which is the potential for economic gain. And of course, project viability, which is project readiness and compatibility. We have about 70 measures in this tool. Again, we've used it for 15 years. So 4 LRTP cycles, the Rural Long Range Transportation Plan. We're using it now for the RSTP project selection process. As I mentioned earlier, we had a pretty robust update as part of the 2045 LRTP, where we took a step back and said, how do we make it better?
I didn't see that, yeah, there was the PDF as well as what has changed. I was curious, for the prioritization tool, what were new factors how has it changed from 2045 to what is being worked on now, 2050?
So it was a lot of work to update it to 2045. It took over a year. So we're not really updating it wholesale between 2045 and 2050, other than tweaking it. And that's in terms of if better data sources become available or ways to analyze. But big changes for 2045 would be resiliency, would be one, is we didn't really have a robust measure for resiliency in our prioritization tool before. We added that in 2045, and we enhanced our equity accessibility measures. And again, we're continuing to improve those, tweaking those for 2050.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I did notice 2045. It was, a significant overhaul in looking at those factors. Just want to see what's changed since, and any of those updates might not have been captured in the 2020 certification review report because it wasn't finalized. So just wanted to make sure that was covered.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, and I'll show you kind of in a little bit later how our approach is changing and being refined a little bit. But this tool is meant to be dynamic. It is meant for us to be reactive to regional priorities as they change, and we can update it. It's a very dynamic tool. It's very flexible, and requires a lot of data and a lot of staff time to evaluate these candidate projects. It's just an example of some of the data that we use.
And so each project is, I think at the end when there are these scores, the score is weighted from the different scenarios. Is that correct? Or
They're averaged. So that's how we show that it is the most robust across these different scenarios, is we're going to score each of those projects are scored with our tool across 4 different scenarios, and they will each produce a score, and then we average those scores, and then those ones that rank the best, that we have confidence in telling our public and our board members that those truly are the most robust and resilient projects.
okay, thank you.
Sure. So in terms of equity considerations, we have a very robust EJ methodology tool, and we have 9 different indicators, and where we're saying these are indicators for different sectors or communities within our region that might experience barriers to mobility. One of the changes that we're doing for 2050 is what we found from when talking with some of our public is environmental justice is confusing to them. They tend to think it's something environmental related, and Title VI is just not a very friendly term either. And so we're taking the approach of just saying what we've identified with these 9 indicators are those communities that are transportation vulnerable communities. And so far, we seem to have a better reaction to that. And one thing we're doing a little bit different is we've created these story maps. We're using them now throughout the 2050, and we're populating that from up front. Before, we just did it at the end. So now in this story map, currently it says, here are those updated transportation vulnerable communities. I don't think I can replay it here, but across our region and how we identify those communities. And then as we get candidate projects, we're going to update the story map, and we're going to say, here are those candidate projects in terms of those transportation vulnerable communities. And then as we score them, we're going to append those scores here. And then as we work with our public and stakeholders to actually fiscally constrain, we're going to keep adding to this story map so people can see transparently how we're making these decisions all along. We're also working on some other equity mapping tools. I've got Kyle here, who's a critical part of my team, and I think Vikas is also watching online. We're not only trying to find better ways to communicate what it is we're doing, but making that data more accessible. So Kyle's working on ways for our stakeholders and the public to be able to say, like put areas and say, I need to know what are the transportation vulnerable communities in this particular area if I'm interested in this project, or maybe I have a separate grant funding opportunity. These are self-serve items that we're trying to put on our website. So hopefully those will be ready here in the next, no pressure, Kyle, month or 2. So excited about that. Resiliency, we have a whole presentation this afternoon. I just wanted to showcase that we continue to enhance our resiliency considerations. We've got some great tools that we use. Again, we'll talk about it more this afternoon, but the information from these tools are being fed into our prioritization process and our decision-making framework for including projects in the LRTP. So this high level shows our planning milestones for the 2050 LRTP, and we are almost about halfway. Our board just approved the vision and goals, and we are actively collecting the needs, identifying those needs for the region for the 2050. So I'm just going to kind of walk through some of these steps. In terms of the plan framework, we've had several surveys that we've put out asking about regional priorities and about drivers of change. 2 public, 1 technical stakeholder survey. The first survey, we had just over 600 participants, basically saying what are these regional priorities we should be aware of when we're planning for transportation 20 years out. And then also asking our technical stakeholders, what did we do well and what did we not do so well last time and how can we make it better, and trying to incorporate that feedback. And then with the scenario planning, those drivers of change and preferred transportation modes, just over 1,500 participants. And that information directly was fed into how we developed our scenarios for 2050. This is our framework that we had our board approve for our scenario planning process. And it's basically 3 pillars where we say, what are the regional place types? And this is based off locality land use planning. So it's marrying up locality planning with regional transportation planning. What are the scenario narratives themselves? What are those storylines? And then what is that greater growth that we're going to be looking at to stress test the transportation system for 2050? These are those drivers of change that we heard from the public, and we just organized them into these different groups of economic, community, technology, and environmental. And we're looking at things like technology and sea level rise. We're looking at affordable housing and how would that look differently across our scenarios. We might have the missing middle in the urban scenario, or maybe it's where there's more available land in our inland scenario out west. These are the actual scenarios themselves for our greater growth, looking at, well, what if growth is focused in urban areas versus suburban areas versus more inland because of sea level rise. And each of these are designed to test something different with the transportation system, whether it's more urban and multimodal travel patterns or overall regional patterns, or those impacts from sea level rise. And of course, there's tons of detail to these scenarios that I'm not really mentioning for the sake of time, but there's different transit assumptions and economics assumptions throughout this. This was for our 2050 baseline, again, based off locality comprehensive plans. And so what we're saying for these greater urban and suburban and inland growth scenarios is, what if those concentrations, densities are different? Obviously, they're going to produce different travel patterns, and that's what we want to be looking at. So we have that resilient and robust transportation network. In terms of our vision and goals, because we have such a really comprehensive and really complicated process, we want to simplify our messaging. So with our vision, it's just simply, we're trying to say, we want to build a transportation system that meets everyone's needs. Transportation for all. Of course, we want it accessible, multimodal, connected, adaptive, etc. We identified our goals. Most of our goals are pretty much prescribed by federal guidelines and state guidelines. We did add a goal for this plan that we did not have formally in previous LRTPs, and that is having equity as a goal in our LRTP. And then, of course, we have lots of objectives that align with those goals, and then they align with federal and state guidelines. So here is where we actively are in the 2050 process, is collecting needs for the LRTP. And our team, both the TPO and PDC, they do fantastic work in identifying needs. So we're making sure that any of those reports and recommendations that we have, if there's a regionally significant recommendation, that's being fed into our LRTP process. Of course, we have traditional means for the public. For the last 2 LRTPs, the public can directly submit candidate projects to us. So we still have that. This time around, Kyle produced this interactive map so the public can go and actually drop in lines or points to where there are transportation issues. In the past, there was only a 30-day window for the public to give us ideas. We've had this up for over a year. So this was, and we've received great feedback that this is a great opportunity for the public to submit directly. And then more recently, we had an interactive workshop with our TPO board. One of the things that we learned as lessons learned from the 2045 was that there was miscommunication with the top. So we're making sure we're not only going from the grassroots up, but from the up, top down. And Pavither had mentioned this earlier. We had, our mayors and CAOs in this room, and it was amazing to hear how much transit discussion were at these tables, and every table made a recommendation for a transit project across the region. So it was fantastic to see that shift, because I would say 10 years ago we would not have heard those conversations. Of course, then next, probably starting in a couple of months, we're going to be evaluating and prioritizing all of those candidate projects, and we're collecting them now. Of course, we'll work with our stakeholders to make sure any project that we have in the LRTP is consistent with locality growth plans, because we don't want to have conflict there. Working on collecting project data, evaluating them with our prioritization tool, and then working with the state, Kevin, and anyone else, Kevin, I say HRTAC, in getting that long-range financial plan for the region. This is a graphic that just shows how we take all those candidate projects, and we have lots of tools that we use to be able to analyze them in our prioritization tools. So we have a land use model, we have a travel demand model, and then an economic model. All these models produce data that give us that robust, objective data for us to feed into our prioritization tool. And this is something with our equity analysis. As we've been trying to improve our prioritization tool, we've been trying to find different measures to incorporate within the prioritization tool. And it's really challenging, because a lot of that, for us to be able to put a measure in the tool, you have to say if it's good or bad, and that requires some value judgment, and that was something that we want to avoid. And as we went to different conferences, what we hear is the main measure for equity is accessibility. We were already reflecting that in our prioritization tool in several ways. So now what we're doing is saying, truly, let's apply that equity lens. So when we're looking at safety, or we're looking at freight issues, or we're looking at congestion, what is the equity lens of those safety benefits across the region, or freight issues or backups, and making sure that those aren't concentrating and burden one community more than another. And of course, closing out with fiscal constraint after we identify all these needs and we say, though these are the most robust, resilient projects for the region, how do we afford it? And making sure that we have a reasonable way and a balanced way to fund these projects. I did not mention this earlier, but for several LRTPs now, we do have a fiscal constraint guideline that we develop with our stakeholders so that we can make sure that there is a balanced split between highway, transit, and active transportation projects. And of course, through all of this, we are being mindful of those planning emphasis areas. With each of these, we are addressing them in one way or another within our prioritization process or scenario planning process, or in our communication with our stakeholders. And even the data sharing and the planning and environmental linkages, that's just something we've done internally to say, we're doing great work. How do we make that more efficient to reflect it within our own processes? And then finally, this slide is, we've been recognized for best practices with our 2045 long-range transportation planning process, and I hope for the 2050 as well. So I don't intend for you guys to read any of this, but these are conferences where we were asked to showcase our work. On the left, these are peer exchanges over the last couple, 2 or 3 years that we've been asked to showcase our scenario planning or resiliency or equity or prioritization work. And of course, in FHWA's model LRTPs, we were noted in there. And we're also currently working on another NCHRP report with integrating uncertainty in long-range transportation plans. So I just wanted to close with that. I know it's a lot of information, so I'd be happy to take any more questions. Thank you.
Questions?
One thing that, well, there's a couple things that I took note of, but going back to the regional transportation needs, looking at that at a 20-year planning timeframe, I reviewed the transit candidate projects. I guess the candidate projects, looking at the LRTP, these are only for, I guess, new projects and not maintenance? Is that how that's presented, or are maintenance projects also
So with
I guess
the,
candidate projects.
so with the LRTP, we can't list every single transportation project. We're only required to list the regionally significant. So when it comes to transit, it really is only fixed guideway. But we do want to acknowledge that there are bus stops and bus routes that need to occur in this 20-year timeframe. So we have set-asides for our transit agencies that are reflected in the LRTP, because that is a financial responsibility. So even though we might not be individually listing the bus routes and the bus stops, because there are too many, that's done in the TIP. We're saying here's a set-aside for these other regional transit projects, these smaller scope transit projects that are occurring. But we are reflecting the major ones. So the 757 Express, any study for a fixed guideway, those are the ones that we're reflecting in the LRTP. Same with active transportation. There's tons of different active transportation projects. We're only highlighting and individually listing the ones we consider more regional in nature. The rest is captured in a set-aside and through the TIP.
That makes sense, as those more regionally significant will go through the project prioritization tool, which I'm thinking, oh, what do you do to maintain the system? Bus replacements. And so I guess having a bus replacement project going through that tool might be a little hard to use those factors, as they don't really align as much with other sites of infrastructure.
We do in the TIP process, but in the LRTP, so we have that maintenance set aside right off the top, at 17 billion. That's set aside for some of this. And then those
I
smaller.
guess those projects are just referenced as maintenance, and it's not like its own.
Well, they're referenced either as maintenance or smaller scope projects.
Okay.
And so we're acknowledging that there are thousands of these that we're not going to individually list. And when it comes to fiscal constraint for the LRTP, we only have to fiscally constrain those regionally significant projects. But again, we're acknowledging that they're smaller scope by these set-asides. So that there's two set-asides, really, the maintenance set-aside and then a smaller scope set-aside within the LRTP. And again, those are captured in the TIP.
Okay, thank you. And I did see with even the 2045, but having the different layers, that's something that I don't see in many LRTPs with the candidate projects and the demographic data and the candidate projects by all transportation modes and then connecting them as well. So that's good work from the last LRTP, and even seeing the new visualization techniques and story mapping live now. That's great work and exciting. And that's one thing I noticed too with the public participation is the update cycle and how it's several years, and that's reflected in the UPWP of having specific activities related to the updating that's going to happen in each fiscal year. And getting the surveys from the public, not just 30 days before the plan is due for update. So really engaging while the project prioritization is being determined and not after selected and the work being done from the MPO. So just want to say good work on that, and early engagement with the public to, in the end, select which projects are recommended for funding.
I appreciate that. We do take that very serious, that we want to make sure that we have early and continuous public involvement. So from the very beginning, right, what are the regional priorities? What's the vision? What are the needs? How should we score them? What can we afford? The public is involved all the way through. And all of our committees are involved all the way through before decisions are made. We do have checkpoints where we do have the board make some decisions just for efficiency, so we don't have to keep recreating the wheel when we're close to 2026. We want to make sure we have a plan that's ready to adopt.
I think the way the LRTP and in general, most of our work, we will go to, the CAC is one of the avenues that we go to, but as Dale had that slide, it's not just the CAC, it's surveys. In this case, it was a survey. Sometimes it's this portal that's available for a year. So we use different techniques. Coming back to what you had earlier, we have specific activities we do as each of our programs. There's an overall public engagement, but then there's some specific. So Dell needs action by the board. We make sure we go to the public, get their feedback. That trickles out, and so when the board takes action, we from bottom up, taking information from the public and share that as well.
In terms of public engagement, especially for your surveys, are you seeing that there are some jurisdictions, some are more responsive to the surveys, citizens are more responsive to the surveys in some jurisdictions than other jurisdictions? And where you see that there may be an issue with in terms of responses, how do you have a sit down and maybe talk about, well, from a metric standpoint, how can we improve on our numbers?
We do look at that. One of the first things we'll look at is the distribution. We want to make sure the survey responses we have cover the region, and they have. Obviously, we're going to get more responses where there's more density. But yeah, it does tend to favor the urban localities because there are more people there. But then that's when we make the targeted outreach to go out to our less populated areas or our rural areas to make sure that we're getting that one-on-one engagement, or putting flyers up in their community centers or their administrative buildings or libraries, advertising in their papers, whatever we need to do to help balance it, making sure we're getting good regional representation. Did I wow you?
Yeah, that was. And yeah, if you wouldn't mind sending a copy of the presentation, so great, thank you. Hey, that's great with all the awards, and that should validate the great work that HRTPO does with their long-range transportation planning and from scenario planning, which I did see reference in the 2045 LRTP and being a statewide accommodation and precedent for, I guess, other either Virginia or state coastal regions to use. So that's yeah, great to see.
Appreciate that. It definitely is a team effort. Everyone, every department, TPO and the PPC has their thumbprint on the long-range transportation plans.
Great work too with maybe I spent a little bit checking out for 2050 and the interactive, but it's always trying to make I guess the involvement with the public more, yes, user friendly, but then I guess interesting and more dynamic than